Ram is perhaps the greatest mystery of them all. Hemp, man. Hemp, weed, grass, cannabis, marijuana, pot and dope, ganja. The list goes on and on. It doesn't matter what you call it. It is all the same, man. The word marijuana was totally absent from the American vocabulary before the reefer madness hysteria of the 1930s. Few people even realized that the marijuana and hemp were one and the same, or that the marijuana prohibition was about to destroy a booming new hemp industry, an industry that was capable of an enormous variety of new products and uses for generations. Cannabis can't supply nearly everything fossil fuels can without the environmental damage. First, the basics. The genus cannabis includes 3 species. 1, Cannabis sativa, the most widely used in industry, medicine, and recreation. 2, Cannabis indica, grows shorter and more bushy than the sativa plant. The primary uses are identical. And 3, Cannabis ruderalis, the least known and desirable of the species because of its small size and its low THC content. The important thing to remember here is that it is not the species of the plant that distinguishes its characteristics, but the gender. In all these species, the male plant is commonly referred to as hemp. It is used for commercial and industrial products such as rope, textiles, fabrics, construction material, paper, oils, and fuel.
It's been around a long time. Folks began growing it long before recorded history. But let's begin with the earliest colonial settlements around 1620.
By order of King James of England, every colonist was required to grow hemp for export back to England. By the mid-18th century, George Washington's primary crop at Mount Vernon was hemp.
Perhaps a contributing factor to the American Revolution.
Well, this is nothing. You should see Monticello. Make the most of the Indian hemp seed and sow it everywhere. George Washington, 1794.
Hemp is of first necessity to the wealth and protection of the country. Thomas Jefferson, 1790. There were 8,000 hemp plantations in the United States in 1850.
Why use up the forests which were centuries in the making and the mines of which required ages to lay down if we can get the equivalent of forest and mineral products in the annual growth of the hemp fields? Henry Ford, 1941.
Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, cannabis was common as cotton or aspirin. It was popular and was enjoyed regularly in neighborhood taverns and pubs.
In 1906, the United States Congress decided to put restrictions on the use of certain poison substances such as alcohol, morphine, heroin, and opium. Cannabis got locked into this category probably because most of the poison abuse was coming from the pharmaceutical industry, and cannabis oil was as common as cough syrup at the time. More regulations, restrictions, and legislation continued until the 1930s when Harry Anslinger, newly appointed head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, decided to make all recreational substances illegal. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act made the possession or transfer of cannabis illegal throughout the United States. Special interest groups joined the attack, and in 1957, the last commercial hemp fields were harvested.
Ever since Anslinger's vicious assault on cannabis in the 1930s, the female gender of the plant has come to be known as marijuana, used for recreational and medicinal purposes. Marijuana has become the all-inclusive name commonly used to encompass the entire cannabis species.
Today's hearing is entitled Mixed Signals, the administration's stance on marijuana.
What's more dangerous and what is more addictive? Cocaine and meth or marijuana? Pretty simple.
I think that conversation minimizes the harm.
No, I'm not trying to minimize the harm. I want to know which is more dangerous and addictive.
As a public health person, one of the things that we look at is not what's the relative risk of one drug.
Okay. If a professional like you cannot answer clearly that meth is more dangerous than marijuana, which every kid on the street knows, if you can't answer that, you, sir, represent what's part of the problem. Your inability to answer me whether tobacco or marijuana is more dangerous, again, is part of the problem. We have been able to drop dramatically tobacco use without locking people up, without arresting. I think this administration has seen 3 to 4 million people arrested for marijuana since it's been in office.
This is not from a bureaucrat in Washington. These are from parents who struggle on a daily basis and have been devastated by addiction in their kids. Legalizing marijuana sends the absolute wrong message to our youth.
With all due respect, you should be listening to scientists. I understand the parents who are grieved because their child died of an overdose. They didn't overdose on marijuana. And you're listening to them rather than the scientists? Mr. Botticelli, you can't handle the truth. Marijuana doesn't kill you. Heroin does and meth does. They're different. Harry Anslinger started. You know who Harry Anslinger is, don't you?
I do not, unfortunately.
You never? Well, you should. He started this war in the 30s, and he was tuned out too.
Anslinger was the son-in-law of Andrew Mellon, who was Secretary of the Treasury Department, funded William Randolph Hearst's giant publishing company, and petrochemical giant Lamont DuPont. Mellon also resurrected the defunct Prohibition bureaucracy, putting federal agent Anslinger in charge and calling it the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, whose purpose was to eliminate the new cannabis chemergy industry. Unable to justly attack the promising new hemp industry, Anslinger began calling it marijuana and testified at the 75th Congress in April 1937 that it was different from hemp. That lie began the myths and set back the promising new industry nearly 100 years.
It was a war on Hispanics and African Americans, and that's when they made marijuana illegal was in the 30s. But the war on drugs started under President Nixon. So we started with Anslinger coming down on the Latinos. Nixon did it to get at the blacks. Then we have Mr. Ehrlichman, White House counsel to President Nixon, said, look, we understand we couldn't make it illegal to be young or poor or black in the United States. We understand that drugs were not the health problem we were making them out to be. But it was such a perfect issue for the Nixon White House, we couldn't resist it. I just want y'all to know the underpinnings of the policies that you are carrying out. We knew we were lying about the health effects on marijuana, but this is what we were doing to win the election, and it worked. 43 years ago, admitted all fantasy, and it's still Schedule 1. We are aiders and abettors of Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Nixon.
We expect to continue to enforce in every state whenever that is implicated, whether the state has a state law legalizing it or not.
Especially now that recreational marijuana is legal, it's just, to me, inconceivable that this is still happening.
We don't have a war on drugs, we have a war on people. I have never seen a DEA agent point an automatic weapon at a marijuana plant. But a few of my friends working in dispensaries have had automatic weapons pointed at their heads. A few people that I've reported on have had armor-clad thugs breaking into their homes, throwing flashbang grenades, wearing body armor, shooting their dogs while their children are in the house. And wait a minute, it's not even really a war on drugs, because in this society we celebrate drugs. You can't turn on TV without seeing another drug ad. Even the evil one, the one we all know is awful and terrible, we at least tolerate it. I used to work at a company that had a shelter outside so the nicotine addicts could go and get their fix. What we have here is a war on certain American citizens using non-pharmaceutical, non-alcoholic, tobacco-free drugs.
Marijuana's classification as a Schedule I narcotic must be reconsidered.
Botticelli, your hands are tied on Schedule 1. But it is ludicrous, absurd, crazy to have marijuana in the same level as heroin.
The administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration.
How have your views changed on marijuana in those 30 years?
To be quite honest with you, sir, very little.
I was afraid of that. The fact that it's changed very little says a lot.
You want me to respond to your question,
No, sir, because I know you would. We have limited time. The fact that it's changed very little shows that you haven't kept up with society, you haven't kept up with science, and it's part of the problem. What are our common values?
I would venture to guess all of law enforcement, just about every single parent.
Every single parent?
Yeah.
The fact is 55% of Americans are in favor of decriminalization or legalization. I got to imagine some of them are parents. I mean, your statement that all parents are against this is ludicrous. What do you think? People that are in favor of decriminalization
I didn't
and
say all.
policy don't procreate?
I said every single parent out there as well.
55% of America.
Are they all parents?
I don't think that the polls went into that, but I suspect a whole bunch of them were. Let's get beyond Richard Nixon.
Speaking for reform, Professor Pro. Speaking against reform, the con man. It's a Schedule 1 drug, see? It's dangerous. It's against the law, illegal. You break the law, you should go to jail, see?
1970, only 16% of our prison population was drug-related. Today it's over 50%, and the majority of those convictions are for marijuana. It is no coincidence that cannabis became a Schedule 1 drug in 1970 at the exact time Nixon needed a weapon against the youth of America protesting Vietnam War policy.
It was a temporary placement as a Schedule 1 drug, see? Pending the results of the Schaefer Commission.
The National Commission on Marijuana Schaefer report recommended decriminalization. Nixon lied to the American people, and then he established the DEA to enforce the bogus laws. Shortly afterwards, Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment. How he got away with it all is very mysterious indeed.
Our prison population has expanded eightfold since 1970.
8 times, and knowing the whole time that cannabis is not harmful. Marijuana laws are based on lies.
Our nation now has the greatest number of prisoners of any country in the world. Nearly 1 in every 100 adults in America is in prison or jail.
Victimless crimes. Everyone knows that marijuana never hurt anyone. The trumped-up charges are perpetuated by prisons, law enforcement agencies, pharmaceutical corporations, and the tobacco and alcohol industries. Marijuana victims deserve restitution.
Thank you.